Next year comes, he heads down into Italy, he's heading straight for Rome, and the Pope goes and meets Attila, and they have lunch together at this river.
Hey everyone, in today's video, we're going to watch a really interesting clip of Lex Fridman and a historian breaking down the fall of ancient Rome. They'll go over some of the key reasons behind the empire's collapse, like political issues, military defeats, and social changes. But there's also a super cool moment in this clip when they talk about the meeting between the Pope, Leo the Great, and Attila the Hun, if you remember Mulan, to defeat the Huns. Wow. Hopefully that doesn't get copyrighted. It's a fascinating clip, fascinating scene. And then after that clip, I want to contrast what this historian is saying with the perspective of St. Augustine from the City of God. While the historian focuses on the worldly factors, how historians focus in on kind of the factors within the actual time frame, history, looking at the military defeats and such, I want to focus in on St. Augustine's theological interpretation of what happened during this time frame. So basically having a secular and a theological viewpoint on the fall of Rome, I think will help us to contrast and to provide very, very clear ways that we can think about how to think about history and also how we are to think about how God is working in history. I think this is very important.
So the most common date that people say, maybe you can correct me on this, that the Roman Empire fell is 476 AD. They're referring to the fall, quote unquote, of the Western Roman Empire. So why did the Roman Empire fall?
Yeah, this is a real game. Pick your favorite date for the fall of the Roman Empire. 476 is a very common one. And what happens in that year is a barbarian king comes down into Italy and deposes a guy named Romulus Augustulus, which is an amazing name. It's combining the names of the founder of Rome, Romulus, with Augustus, the second founder of Rome. And so some people say that's the end of the Roman Empire. Sure. But others say it's 410 when Alaric sacks Rome for the first time. Others say it's 455 when the Vandals come and sack Rome and do a much more thorough job of it this time. Some say it's 180 when Marcus Aurelius picks poorly in succession. Some say it's 31 when Octavian wins the Battle of Actium and kills the Roman Republic. Or you can go past that date and say it's 1453 when the Eastern Roman Empire finally falls. And I mean, the Eastern Empire is legitimately the Roman Empire. If you were going to ask them, who are you? They wouldn't say, we're the Byzantines, we're the Eastern Roman Empire. They would just say, we're the Romans. And they have a completely legitimate claim to do that. So this whole game of when does the empire fall is problematic. And the other thing is all those dates about invasions that cluster around the 400s, so 410, 455, 476, you have to ask yourself, who counts as a real Roman by that point? Because for a while now, the Romans themselves are often coming from barbarians, are crossing that boundary. Roman generals, they might get raised as a Hun, then serve with the Roman army for a while, then not, or Visigoths or not. That's been going on for a long time. So what makes someone a real Roman? How do you tell that the guy kicked out in 476 was a, quote, real Roman and the barbarian king who took his place wasn't? That's a very arbitrary decision.
There's so many interesting things there. So, of course, you described really eloquently the decline that started after Marcus Aurelius. And there's a lot of competing ideas there and the tensions.
Just to interrupt you, I hate wishy-washy answers, which is what I kind of said. So I will give you this.
Yes.
I think by the end of the 5th century AD, the Western Roman Empire has transformed into something different.
Yeah.
So I don't know what date I can pick for that, but I can say by around 500, I don't know that we can call whatever exists there the Roman Empire anymore.
And of course, the barbarians make everything complicated because they seem to be willing to fight on every side, and they're like fluid.
Yes.
Which they integrate fast, and it just makes the whole thing really tricky to say, who's a Roman, who's not, and at which point did it like.
And barbarians have been forming large parts of the Roman army for centuries. Yeah, it's extremely fluid and not at all just clear sides here. So it's a mess.
From a military perspective, perhaps, what are some things that stand out to you on the pressure from the barbarians, the conflicts, whether it's the Huns or the Visigoths?
There was a military strategist, a guy named Edward Luttwak, who wrote this book, The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire, which was basically about frontiers
Hmm.
and how did the Romans define their frontier. And everybody's jumped on this and argued about it and says it's wrong and all, but started this debate among Roman historians about, yeah, what does frontier mean to the Romans? Did they conceive of their empires having a border, or was it always expanding, or what? And did they have a grand strategy? I mean, today militaries have a strategy where we want to achieve this, we want to exert force here, we want to protect these areas. Did the Romans even visualize their empire in that sort of grand strategic way? And it's a real debate. I mean, there's some things that suggest, oh, here they tried to rationalize the border and shorten it by taking this territory. Other people see it as just kind of random. So that's an interesting take, is how did the Romans conceive of empire? I mean, if you look back at someone like Virgil at the time of Augustus, he said, well, the gods granted Rome empire without end. So it's that open-ended thing. But even under Augustus, he seems to be pulling back and saying, well, I'm going to kind of stop at the Rhine. I'm going to kind of stop at the Danube. We don't need to keep expanding forever in the way we've been doing. So, I mean, that's an interesting concept of how do the Romans see their empire? Does it have a boundary? What are those boundaries? What does that mean?
And then barbarians were very much uh, making that boundary even more difficult to kind of define it, even if you wanted to.
Right. And again, the other fun debate is, were these invasions, when the Visigoths cross the Danube and come into the Roman Empire, is this an invasion as it was originally described, or is it a migration, as
Hmm.
some scholars have started calling it? Because the Visigoths were fleeing pressure from another Gothic group, and they were fleeing pressure from the Huns. And I mean, a lot of the early Gothic peoples who come into the Roman Empire are basically seeking asylum.
Hmm.
They're saying, will you give us a piece of territory to live on within the boundaries of the empire? And in return, we will fight for you against external enemies. And the Romans make these deals with some of the Goths. In fact, they made a pretty good deal with the Goths. One group of Goths to do exactly that. Like, you can settle within the boundaries. We'll feed you. We'll give you a certain amount of stuff, and you fight for us. And then the Romans treated them really badly. They kind of didn't supply what they had promised, and so they turned against the Romans with good reason. So the Romans blundered in these things too.
So is it correct that the Visigoths fought on the side of the Romans against Attila the Hun?
Some of them did.
Okay.
So again, there were various groups on both sides of those battles. So Attila is the famous Hun, and he comes into the Roman Empire and seems to be heading right for Rome to knock it off. And everybody is so scared of the Huns that this weird coalition comes together
Mhm.
of the Romans plus various barbarian groups against Attila in league with some other barbarian groups, and they fight a huge battle, and it's more or less a stalemate.
Mhm.
So Attila gets stopped, and he says, all right, we're going to just rest up for a year. Next year, we'll go finish off the Romans. Next year comes, he heads down into Italy. He's heading straight for Rome, and the Pope goes and meets Attila, and they have lunch together at this river. And at the end of the lunch, Attila goes back and says, I changed my mind. We're going to go back up to France, hang around for another year. We'll finish off the Romans later. And, Christian sources say saints appeared in the sky with flaming swords and, scared away Attila. Some other sources say, well, the Pope gave Attila a huge bribe to go away for a while. Believe whichever you like. But then Attila ends up dying on his wedding night before he comes back under mysterious circumstances. And so that never materializes. And the Huns kind of fragment after his death.
So just to recap, what we saw was a historian walk through some of the historical points for the fall of ancient Rome. He highlighted many things. He highlighted political corruption, military struggles, and the empire's inability to handle social unrest, to just name a few. He talks about some of the difficulties of dates and all of that stuff. It was a very, very interesting clip to just kind of focus in on what history, what scholars are saying about the fall of ancient Rome. And then, of course, that clip on Pope Leo and Attila the Hun. I had never known that the Pope had met with Attila the Hun. Very, very fascinating. A very, very intriguing look at history. But here's the thing, while these worldly factors definitely played a role in Rome's collapse, I think as a Christian, we know that there is something much deeper going on here. There is a spiritual interpretation that we need to look at in order to understand properly what happens in history and how we are to even understand history in the first place. As Christians, we believe that God is providentially working in history and working through people, and He's basically leading everything up to a culminating event when Jesus Christ will return. Now, it's really fascinating because St. Augustine, in light of the fall of Rome, the sacking of Rome by the Visigoths, I think they were mentioned in this clip, if I remember right, he provides a very, very interesting book called The City of God, where he reflects on the fall of Rome. And again, the point is that Augustine wasn't focused, much like this historian was, on the political issues, the military struggles, the differing difficulties in understanding history, but Augustine was focused on what he did know. He knew God, and he knew the character of God, and he knew that God had revealed himself in the scriptures. And since that was the case, he provided a reflection upon the city of men and the city of God. So, in the end, here, I just want to provide an explanation of St. Augustine of Hippo's The City of God. It'll be really, really helpful to help you to understand what happened in Rome from a theological, historical viewpoint. This is very fascinating. So, St. Augustine wrote The City of God, and it is one of the most influential works of Christian philosophy and theology. It was written in the response to the chaos following the sack of Rome. Augustine's work tackles some pretty big questions, and these are things we need to be focusing in on. What's actually going on in history? Is Christianity to blame for Rome's collapse? This is something that should really spark our interest for how we are to understand the rise and falls of all empires, maybe even our own, the empire that we live in, that we see that might be imploding, that might be in a state of chaos. Through the City of God, Augustine sets out to defend Christianity against its critics, okay, offering an intriguing vision of human history and a spiritual analysis into the moral, spiritual, and political forces that shape the world. His answer? Two cities, the city of God and the city of man. And these two cities stand in constant tension, representing two different ways of life. Okay, so let's break this down, what all of this means and how to speak and how it really reflects and impacts us today. When Rome fell to the barbarians, it wasn't just any old city going down. It was Rome. And this is so important to see. It was the heart of the empire, the pinnacle of civilization, we could say, the eternal city in the eyes of the Romans themselves, or so they thought. Naturally, people started freaking out and looking for someone or something to blame for the imploding of Rome. So many pointed fingers at Christianity. Now, the historian, I think, mentions in this clip that that necessarily isn't the case, but at least during this time frame, because Augustine was from that time period, that's what they were thinking. That's what they were hearing. So many people pointed the finger at Christianity, which had been on the rise ever since Constantine made it the empire's official religion. Critics claimed the abandonment of the traditional Roman gods had angered the heavens and weakened the empire. So here comes in Augustine. In the City of God, he's quick to shut down these claims. Rome's decline, he argues, wasn't Christianity's fault, but a result of its own internal moral decay and rot. The empire was crumbling from within long before Christianity came into the picture. Its moral decay, not the absence of its pagan gods, was its real undoing. Rome's fall becomes Augustine's platform to make a bigger point. Every earthly kingdom, no matter how great, is temporary. The only eternal city, the one that really matters, is the city of God. This is where Augustine introduces his famous concept of the two cities in this famous work, The City of God. And no, he's not talking about actual geographical locations. Instead, these two cities represent two kinds of people, two kinds of love, and ultimately two different ways of life. The city of God is made up of people who love God above all else. They live according to his will and seek to build their lives around his divine truth. As Augustine puts it, two loves have made two cities. Love of self, even to the contempt of God, has made the earthly city. Love of God, even to the contempt of self, has made the heavenly city. These are the people whose hearts are set on eternity. On the flip side, the city of man is all about self love, pride, and earthly desires. Its citizens are focused on worldly things like power, pleasure, and possessions, rather than the things of God. This city is destined for destruction in accordance with biblical wisdom, but for now it coexists alongside the city of God. Augustine's two cities aren't just philosophical concepts, they reflect a deeper reality about the human condition. Each of us is part of one city or the other, depending on what we love and where we place our hope. One of the coolest things Augustine does in the City of God is flip the typical Roman way of thinking about history on its head, and I would argue the American way of thinking about history on its head. Most people in the ancient world saw history as cyclical or just a series of empires rising and falling. Augustine says, hold on, history isn't random or just doomed to repeat itself. It's actually going somewhere. So the famous adage that history repeats itself, according to Augustine, is not true. For Augustine, history is linear with a clear beginning, creation, and a definitive end, the final judgment when Jesus Christ comes back. More importantly, it's guided by God's providence over everything. So while it might look like chaos from our perspective, wars, famines, the fall of Rome, in this case, you name it, everything is moving toward the ultimate realization of the city of God, the new heavenly Jerusalem. He writes, the city of God we speak of is everlasting. For that other city, the city of man, though it is called eternal, is only for a period whose end is fixed for the duration of its reign. In other words, Rome's rise and fall are just a tiny blip in the grand scheme of things in God's eyes. The real story is what God is doing behind the scenes, drawing humanity toward the fulfillment of his eternal plan. So there's obvious critiques with this. In addition to defending Christianity, Augustine goes on the offensive against Roman paganism. A big chunk of the City of God is dedicated to debunking the idea that Roman gods had protected the empire and their abandonment led to its downfall. Augustine isn't having any of that way of thinking. He points out that Rome had experienced plenty of disasters way before any of this took place: plagues, invasions, civil wars, long before Christianity showed up. So blaming the Christian God for the empire's misfortunes doesn't really add up in Augustine's eyes. He asks, and this is Augustine, but their gods failed them utterly in the most recent calamity when the barbarians sacked Rome. Why should they then still rely on those pagan gods? Basically, if the Roman gods were so powerful, why didn't they stop the Visigoths? Interesting question. Even more than that, Augustine critiques the whole moral system that paganism promotes. He shows how the Roman gods often encouraged vice rather than virtue. Idol worship, greed, and the pursuit of pleasure were all part of the deal to these Roman deities in this Roman religious lifestyle. Christianity, on the other hand, calls people to live lives of love, humility, and self-control, the things that actually make societies flourish. At the heart of Augustine's worldview is his belief in divine providence, the idea that God is in control of everything that happens in the world, even when it seems like everything else is falling apart. For Augustine, you see, this means that no matter how dark things get, there's always a bigger plan at play in accordance with God's character. He famously says, God knows how to order his creation in such a way that out of what seems evil, he brings forth good. That's a pretty radical statement when you think about it. It means that even all of the bad stuff that takes place, like the fall of Rome to the Romans, or the suffering we experience in our own lives, and maybe the demise of America that we're beginning to see, can be used by God for a greater purpose. For Augustine's audience, who had just seen their empire crumble, this was a game-changing perspective, a perspective that Christianity brought. Instead of freaking out about the collapse of Rome, Augustine tells them to focus on the eternal city of God, where things are secure and unshakable. In the end, God's plan will prevail and history is heading toward a divine conclusion. Let's look at the virtue of these two cities and why we should want the heavenly city. So what does it look like to live in a citizen what does it look like to live as a citizen of one of those cities? Augustine spells it out pretty clear. In the city of man, people are all about pride, selfishness, and getting ahead. Therefore it falls. It's a dog eat dog world where people are constantly vying for power and pleasure. But Augustine warns that this kind of life is ultimately empty and destructive. In contrast, the city of God is characterized by virtues like humility, love, and justice. Augustine isn't big on the idea that virtue isn't something we achieve on our own. Instead, it's a gift from God. He's not big on that idea. Made possible through God's grace. He writes, virtue leads to a blessed life and nothing else does. In other words, living a good life, one that brings true happiness, means aligning ourselves with God's will and His grace. An interesting perspective of Augustine is the role of the church in this city. Here's where Augustine really hits home for his Christian readers. He argues that while the full realization of the city of God is in the future, the church is its representative here on earth. The church is kind of like a preview of the heavenly city, guiding people towards salvation and helping them to live out the values of the city of God. But Augustine is also realistic. He knows that the church on earth isn't perfect. It's a mixed bag of saints and sinners, all trying to live out their faith in a broken world. He writes, the church even now is the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of heaven. And accordingly, even now, his saints will reign with him. So there's an overlap here. The church is already part of the city of God, but it's also still on its pilgrimage, waiting for the final fulfillment of heaven. Augustine has a pretty sobering view of human nature, and that's also evident within the city of God. And I think maybe this historian would have done better to focus on this as well. Augustine has a pretty sobering view of human nature. He believes that humans were created good, but because of Adam and Eve's sin, we're all born with a tendency towards sin, what he calls original sin. He was basically the creator of this doctrine, even though he found it in Scripture. This affects every aspect of our lives and leaves us in desperate need of God's grace. For man is, as it were, divided in himself as a result of that sin of disobedience. Augustine, and this is what Augustine writes. In other words, we're constantly torn between our desires and what we know is right. The good we want to do is often overshadowed by the selfish desires pulling us towards the city of man. There's the city of man within all of us. But here's the good news. According to Augustine, God's grace is more powerful than our sinful nature. And this is really helpful to help us understand why he's making this comparison between the city of God and the city of man in the first place, and understanding God and his character and his providence. God is going to bring about the good in all of this. This is where Augustine's understanding of grace really comes into play. He argues that without God's grace, we are incapable of living righteous lives or even choosing the good. But with grace, we can overcome our sinful tendencies and live as citizens of the city of God in pilgrimage. The will of man is not taken away by grace, but it is changed from evil to good and assisted when weak. Augustine's focus on grace became hugely influential throughout much of human history. In short, Augustine says we're all a bit of a mess, but through God's grace, we can be redeemed and live the kind of virtuous, godly life that reflects the eternal city of God. And to be honest, when I look at history, I think that is a better interpretation and look at history and what has happened. The fact that we're still here, that we're actually progressing. I think democracy is a lot better than Attila the Hun, don't you think? And so I think that his interpretation is correct. So what can we take away from all of this? Augustine's City of God might have been written in the 5th century, but its insights are still incredibly relevant today. At its core, the book challenges us to think about where our true allegiances lie. Are we living for the temporary things of this world, or are we living for something eternal? In a time when it's easy to get caught up in political upheaval, personal ambitions, or material concerns, much like the Romans when Rome fell, Augustine reminds us that these things are part of the city of man. It's normal. The city of man is fragile, fleeting, and ultimately doomed to pass away. It's just going to pass away because it's not eternal. It's temporary. The city of God, on the other hand, calls us to live with a different set of values, humility, love for God, and a vision for eternity. In a world where empires rise and fall, and where life can sometimes seem like a mess, Augustine's message is clear. The city of God is our ultimate destination, and God's providence is guiding us there, even when it's hard to see. That eternal city, rooted in God's love and justice, is where true peace and fulfillment is found. And that, Augustine would say, is where our heart should be set. Not on the rise and fall of Rome, not on the rise and fall of America, but on the sheer fact that God's kingdom will resurrect again, and we will be home. And all of this demise, all of this failure will be done away with. The city of God and its king will be ruling and reigning here on earth.